So when I think back to some of my fondest childhood memories, the NES is what is in most of them, which says something about my childhood, I think. But that's a different story for a different time. Well, actually, that's a story that probably won't be really delved into, let's be honest. But the NES was a major piece of my childhood. And I had one pretty early on. We didn't have a lot of money, which I found out later in life, but my grandparents managed to get me an NES when I call it graduated, but back then you really didn't not get past first grade. But when I was done first grade, I got an NES. We used to get report card presents, whether it was a toy or a game or something, and then at the end of the year, there's always going to be a bigger one. It was just something my grandparents did because, well, yes, I was raised by my grandparents. Won't go into the reasons why, but I was raised by my grandparents until they unfortunately passed on. But my first encounter with the NES was actually, I want to say it was by accident. See, one day I came home from school and apparently my grandmother wasn't aware that we were getting out early that day. So she had gone to the store or to run some other errands or something. And I got home and nobody was there. So I went in through the basement because the basement door was always unlocked. And, you know, this was back in the mid to late 80s. So, you know, there wasn't as much of a risk, especially in the small town we lived in, of a lot of people trying to break in. But anyway, so I went and called my uncle and was like, hey, there's nobody here. What's going on? And he was like, all right, I'll come get you in a second. They lived up the street about maybe a mile, maybe two. And they lived in what used to be my great-grandmother's house. So my uncle came down, my good uncle, the awesome uncle. And just in case you've heard me talk about other uncles. He came down and took me up to the house. And they had an NES. Well, this was my first time I'd ever even seen an NES. Up to this point, all I had was an Atari, which belonged to my aunt, that she had given me. And I fell in love. It was complete love at first sight. Playing Mario, I had no idea what I was doing. I figured out Duck Hunt really quick, but I had no idea what I was doing when it came to Mario. I remember later on I'd see it in the arcade, which got quite a few quarters out of me. And this, of course, is before we had an NES of our own. So when I got done with first grade, to go back to that, we got the NES. Now that started off with just Mario Duck Hunt and I believe Mega Man 2. Which is also why that game holds such a special place in my heart. Well, that Christmas, I remember getting The Legend of Zelda. Which, while that does explain why The Legend of Zelda is such a strong place in my heart as well, it's such a great freaking game. But I poured hours upon hours into that game. That game did not leave my NES for probably 6 or 7 months. I eventually had to use a book called How to Win at NES Games that I got from the library to figure out how to beat Ganon. So, yeah, that was the beginning of where it started. Now, as the years went on, I accumulated multiple different games, and it actually was a source of one of the most annoying things I ever did to my grandmother. Because back then the games, I believe, were like 50, 60 bucks. And so eventually I'd beaten a bunch of games and we couldn't really get new ones. Well, used game stores were just starting to exist. This is before GameStop and FuncoLand and all that. There was another one called VGA Game Exchange over in Waldorf, and we went and I forget what I ended up getting, but I got like 2 or 3 games, but I traded in like 10. And it broke my grandmother's heart because she had paid full price for these things and they were giving us, pennies on the dollar. And I didn't know it at the time, but I found out later she didn't want to let me do it. Of course, later on, when FuncoLand, which became GameStop, and Babbage's, which became GameStop and everything, came along, it'd be the same kind of thing where they give you pennies on the dollar for the games. But they sell them at a decent price. At least they used to. Let me say that. Back in the day, you actually could get deals at GameStop, FuncoLand, whatever one it was, depending on what era it was. You actually could get real deals. But anyway, the NES was a very big place in my childhood. I know it was for a lot of other people. And what type of memories do you have of the NES? Let me know if stir some of them old memories. And, well, as you can tell, this was more of an unplanned video. But when I talked about my Super Nintendo memories, it made me think, well, it only makes sense to continue that around and start back with the NES. And I'll also at some point be talking about other systems, because each system holds a special place within my life. Each system, even the more recent ones, when I got them, the circumstances around getting them, especially the Sega Saturn. Well, and the Sega Genesis for that matter. But, yeah. There's a lot to look forward to when it comes to this. And once again, it's beyond a controller. It's been Azure Tony. Today, we talked about some fun and gaming. And I hope you enjoyed yourselves too. Take care of yourself and take care of each other. I'll catch you next time. Arigatou gozaimasu.